world, birds fly south for the winter, bears hibernate, and squirrels brave the cold with their fluffy tails. But what do the Pokemon do when the sharp gales of winter strike? Many of them follow the warm winds south, such as Braviary, who works to follow their prey as they migrate, or Swanna, nesting in new homes to have Duckletts in safer environments. The fish of the world, such as Basculin and Goldeen, fight their way up rapid streams, while Corsola surprisingly migrate to warmer waters. Even legendary and mythical Pokemon globetrot in search for food, shelter, and better weather, such as the super ancient trio holding a second home within Johto, or Shaymin, acting in a behavior called flower carrying that helps spread seeds throughout the world. But what of the many other Pokemon out there? How many of them migrate? When do they pack their bags to leave? And what do they do when they reach their home away from home? After braving the seasons of the past year, through blazing sunshine and blustering cold, I can now show you the hidden world of Pokemon migration. Howdy there, I'm Krillic, and today we'll move alongside the many Pokemon that migrate throughout the world of Pokemon. And as we find out why they migrate in the first place, we'll dig into their inspirations, the real animals that they're based on. Now, I do have this video sectioned off kind of by birds, insects, fish, so on and so forth, and at the end, we'll reach the legendary and mythical Pokemon, but you're not going to want to miss all the other Pokemon leading up to them. The primary focus is making sure that the Pokemon themselves actually migrate and supporting it with real-life evidence. We can't just assume that a Pokemon migrates because of its potential inspiration does. After all, we do have Pokemon that go against the rules all the time, like Hippowdon, who actively eats other Pokemon, while real-life hippos have a common diet of aquatic plants and typically do not eat meat. So let's begin with all the high flyers, our aviators soaring through the clouds, our bird Pokemon. Farfetch'd is only hinted to migrate within the anime, though it should be no surprise that we see this leek-carrying duck as a migrating creature. It's really just our typical depiction of a wild duck, as it literally is just the wild duck Pokemon. Now, you've likely known since you were incredibly little that many birds fly south for the winter from their cold environments. We see birds such as geese and robins fly away only to be seen many months later. The robin returning is typically seen as the first sign of spring's arrival. But they aren't just leaving because it's cold, they leave because they're in need of food. In the case of any duck, or almost any duck, it's no different, though migration would then be dependent on more than the location and species. They're in need of food and water, and once that stops being available, they will leave. And typically, you won't have to worry about trying to feed them from a bird feeder over winter, because it only serves to help whatever birds stick around. They can use the help, especially in our concrete jungle. Assuming you're in a concrete jungle and not in the country in which that whole story just kind of doesn't work. Now, we know that Farfetch'd has a diet consisting of only the leek that we see it with. If it runs out, it just finds another one to use as a sword and a meal. But when we look at leeks in the real world, we find that they're a cool season crop. So they're apparently very well suited for cultivation in places like Wisconsin within the United States. They also do best in full sun and in light, well-drained soil. And when we look at the island in which they are flocking away from, the whole episode started with the idea that this island grows an incredible amount of different fruit, trees, and otherwise edible goods. This would then mean that if Farfetch'd aren't finding their fill of leeks, they will likely not hesitate to fly to another island, gather up the best leeks they can find, and then eventually fly back. That's also assuming we go by Pokemon logic and the leek doesn't go bad within 2 weeks like they would in real life. Otherwise, that's a lot of energy being used to migrate back and forth. In Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, there's an episode that primarily focuses on a Swablu that was struck by lightning while in a tree that it was unable to escape and has to overcome its fear of flying. But the character of the week, Mr. Morita, makes a point that Swablu and Altaria migrate to the nature preserve every single year. When we look at these Pokemon, Swablu does have a number of different traits, but is specifically called Tilto in Japanese, which is literally just bluebird. So not only could this just be your typical bluebird, but with other traits that it has, it is suspected that it may have inspiration from many other birds. Comparisons have been drawn to Oriental magpies for their singing abilities, or the Canada jay for their behavior of sitting on people's heads. Though I took some time to dig through over 100 different birds that have been spotted within Kyushu, which is the location in which Hoenn is inspired by, and there were some birds we could add to that list of inspirations. For example, the Eurasian jay, as I looked for blunt-beaked birds, the long-tailed shrike, which has the same blunt beak but longer tail that Altaria has, and even the long-tailed tit could fit in here. And okay, maybe I included that last one, not just because it's fluffy, but because I also got to say tit in a video in the scientific sense. I wanted to include the Shima Inaga, or Snow Fairy as it's lovingly called, but it wasn't really native to Kyushu, so I don't think that it would be right to fit it in there. Also, I'm pretty sure that's the same bird that is used in the meme. The point here is that at least with Swablu, it has a number of qualities and characteristics that we will find with so many real-life animals that it makes it difficult to see where the ties fully lie or where behaviors connect. So instead, we just focus on what Swablu and Altaria does in different versions. We not only get to know about it migrating within the anime, but we also get to see it within Pokemon Snap, where it is in a natural hot spring set within the area of a volcano, kind of like a caldera, really. Now, these Pokemon like staying clean and love baths even more. Unfortunately, the water will make their fluffy, cottony feathers sopping wet and unable to function, making it look like a rubber chicken with chewing gum strapped to it. Though, at least within this hot spring, it seems like the heat helps ensure that the feathers retain their volume, while also ensuring that they do get clean. And considering the type of birds that this Pokemon is based on, then this location within Snap is no more than a pit stop for our bird on their greater migration journey. Because when we look at locations where it is found, like within Route 114 and 115 within Hoenn, or the Abundant Shrine and the routes just outside it in Unova, we find that they make their homes in forested or high altitude areas with water nearby. This means they get plenty of seeds to eat and clean water to bathe in. With this then, it would be easy to conclude that anytime the cold season comes in, these Pokemon migrate not only for their food, but also to ensure they can bathe easily, explaining their migration patterns. Only found within the Lentil Photodex do we find out that Swanna will migrate all the way over to the Lentil region in order to escape the winter as any of our other birds would. Though the reason for them migrating here is more than just for food, it's so that way they can have babies. It is actually noted that every single ducklet that is found within Lentil is actually born and raised there. And this is likely because the area in which we find them is incredibly safe and full of food such as peat moss and bog moss for them to die for, as this is their favorite food to snack on, or eat, not just a snack, I guess. This is once again a common occurrence in the real world, as an animal's population is primarily limited by resources and safety. The more food, water, and space there is, the higher the population of animals within a species there can be. Eventually, they will reach something that is called the carrying limit, for the term that at least I was taught, which is simply the upper limit in which the population can be supported by the environment in which they have decided to live in. And if food resources start to lower, then it will either push the animals to leave, or they will begin dying off, simply because their home is unable to support them. And this will then in turn affect the population of other creatures that might hunt them. In the case of Ducklet and Swanna, there really aren't any Pokemon that actively hunt them as a main source of food, but by them landing in water and their own diets, we would then see a decrease not only in moss, but also a decrease in aquatic life if we assume that the Swanna have the same diet as real swans. What's funny is that in Unova, you only encounter these Pokemon as shadows flying over Drift Vale and Marvelous Bridge, which could then mean that Unova is a pit stop for them on their migration journey, all while they have a proper presence within Kalos on Route 7 and within Kitakami. I'll also note before we move on that this doesn't mean that they exclusively travel from Kalos or Kitakami through Unova and to Lentil, but it is at least a possibility that we should consider, especially if we finally get to see them in another region, hopefully with a stronger population. An interesting one to consider is actually Unfezant. You wouldn't expect this Pokemon to migrate, but we actually do see its numbers drop when the cold winter arrives within Unova. In addition, we can look at Pokemon Snap once more to find out more about its habits. When we look at Snap, we find Unfezants within all seasonal sections of the forest, though when we look at the summer section, we find a female sitting on a nest of eggs, getting angry if we bother it. When we look at real-life pheasants, they have an incubation period of roughly April 1st to August 1st, essentially from late spring through summer, matching up perfectly with our pheasant Pokemon here and why it has eggs in the summertime. It's also very cute that the Photodex states male and female Unfezants work together to raise their young. One goes out in search of food, while the other stays back at the nest to protect their eggs. As a side, I will say that they may not be migrating and they simply could be hiding away when winter does roll around. But let's also take a tangent regarding cooperation and the raising of young within a species, because you might even be surprised to find out that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of bird species, amongst many other animals in the world, that will not only help raise their young, but even forego mating in order to assist with raising the young of others within their species. Yes, that does mean we have non-biological families of animals working together to help raise their next generation. And it is not just a human trait. This is because if we instill all of existence, or rather distill all of existence, down to its most basic necessities, we get live, mate, raise children, die. That is effectively the only purpose that all living beings have until you start getting into the idea of human consciousness and the existential idea of what is my greater purpose in life? Oh my goodness, maybe I shouldn't eat a bag of cheese at 3 a.m. and then squirt ketchup into my mouth. I don't know. All because thanks to past generations of humanity making life easier for us to have food, water, and shelter, we then begin to have time to think more rather than just surviving, resulting in this soul searching. Meanwhile, any other animal is just mostly happy with existing. Oh, to be a lizard on a rock, basking in the sunlight as I forget about taxes and bills. Wouldn't it be beautiful? So long story short, male and female Unfezants working together to raise their young or even to help raise other young isn't that shocking. Quaxly directly states that it migrated to Paldea long ago, though we get no additional direct information regarding this. When we look at its final evolution, Quaquaval's information, we also are told that it dances in ways that evokes faraway places, meaning that its dancing is from a different region. There are actually a number of Pokemon that do dance, whether it be the tap dancing we get in Mr. Rhyme, the 4 styles of dancing we get from Oricorio using Senzu for traditional Japanese dancing, Baile for Spanish dancing fit with even the red frills of the dress, Pom Pom for your bright and cheery cheerleader, or Urapao, otherwise known as drum dancing, though we still have Quaquaval here not matching up with any of them or other Pokemon. Instead, the type of dancing that it practices is a very special type of dancing that was used and practiced right in front of slave owners, so that way Brazilian slaves, amongst other types of slaves, could fight back and escape their oppressors. This style of dancing is known as capoeira. Now, Paldea is effectively the Iberian Peninsula, as it has a mixture of different values, cultures, and traditions that are primarily within Spain and Portugal, though it also borrows from other cultures such as Mexican for the Fuecoco line, and then of course Brazil with the Quaquaval. What's more interesting then is that while slaves have not been a thing in Pokemon thus far, we've had themes of quote-unquote slavery and oppression within Pokemon within the main story of Unova, mainly because of the concept of freeing Pokemon from their Pokeballs, as said technology might be seen as a way to force unfair containment on Pokemon. And then we can dig from here with Quaquaval into knowing that the fighting typing is effectively the hero typing within Pokemon. Honorable individuals that fight for justice or at least use their martial prowess in positive ways. This is important to keep in mind because Quaquaval is a water fighting type, yet we aren't told about it having martial prowess. Almost as if, just like how capoeira was designed to be, this dancing that Quaquaval does is hidden from us as a fighting style. And again, I doubt that there will ever be a slavery story within Pokemon, but I do believe that we might find out where Quaquaval, or rather Quaxly, originally comes from, and it's there that we'll find a Pokemon that is a dark type, an evil or underhanded typing that Quaxly's line had to deal with until they could evolve to fight against what may be their would-be natural predator in their homeland. What could that Pokemon be? That's really hard to say, honestly, since there are a number of animals that hunt ducks for a meal, whether it be foxes, bears, coyotes, or even raccoons who might go after ducklings or duck eggs, meaning there are plenty of different inspirations to choose from. And I personally hope that they do choose a raccoon. I would love to have a little trash panda on my team one day. It would be on my team the second I see it until the end of the game. Our last migrating bird is Braviary, which we would not have known if we hadn't seen that it used to live within Hisui, which would eventually be renamed to Sinnoh. Yet not even within the remakes of the region do we find Rufflet or Braviary. So why is that? There are two possibilities. One is because of humanity, the other is because of the change in the climate. Because while Hisui is described as wintry and harsh, or wintry and austere, through what we find in the old verses, and even just by traveling through the lands do we see just how cold it is, but also because Pokemon like Growlithe have thicker coats of fur, and Polion can be found on the beach, and then we have the massive block of ice that we find in the Alabaster Highlands, which is just one massive winter wonderland to begin with. But despite all of this, we really don't see all that much snow in any place except in the Highlands. But when we jump to modern day Sinnoh, we see that there's snow in Twin Leaf Town, which is in the southern part of the region, and while we don't have an exact spot for this location, just speculation, we can at least say that it has gotten colder over time just by looking at the southern parts of Hisui, which don't have any snow in it. Then again though, this might just mean that the weather patterns have changed, climate has generally shifted, or a number of other factors that we're unable to know for sure, unless we look at real life Hokkaido. With Hokkaido, it is nice and simple. It has only gotten warmer by an average of 1.28 Celsius or 2.3 Fahrenheit every 100 years from 1898 to 2021. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal. It's like, oh, you don't even notice it. But that is all of Japan, not just Hokkaido. And you can't even use your microwave to warm the center of your grubby little hot pocket, so imagine the power needed to warm up roughly 377,800 square kilometers of area that Japan has. Which, even that is still underselling it and roughly inaccurate, because that's the area of Japan on the actual ground, not the air or atmosphere all around Japan, which has actually warmed up, and the ocean all around it, which has also been warmed by a different temperature amount. Now, I do digress, but I hope you do understand my point. That's a lot of warming up when you put it into perspective. And despite this, we see that Braviary is also living in the seasonal tempered region of Unova. Their encounter rates don't change with the weather, but when we look at Hisui and Braviary, we begin to see a bit of a different story. This is because its Hisuian variant flies south for the winter and into Hisui, a place that is already fairly cold, but clearly must either not be as cold as where it is from, or it is simply where all of its prey has moved to, or is at least easier to catch. We can support this as it will use its screech to send shock waves, psychically, through the water that will then stun prey that lives underwater. And if any lakes up north are frozen over due to the cold and not moving and mixing, then of course Hisui and Braviary would need to migrate in order to get its fill of food to survive. What's stranger yet is that Braviary is a pretty powerful Pokemon, and at least within Hisui, it tends to live a solitary life. Yet within Unova, it is assumed to live in flocks far more. So then what caused that change to even happen? It could just be through their population that caused even their physical form to change. To explain that better, they are built like incredibly efficient hunters. Its Hisuian form has this snowy plumage that is absolutely beautiful, not just because of design, but also because of natural survival. They have something called counter shading, which you are likely to see in a number of different animals such as manta rays in the real world. With counter shading, you blend in differently depending on how people are viewing you or animals are viewing you. In the case of Hisui and Braviary, the snowy top helps it blend with anything that might be looking down on it, while the black underside will help it blend with dark skies covered by night or by clouds. Once again though, we have to ask, why doesn't it have lighter shading? This is likely because, as an eagle, it is more apt to hunt diurnally, meaning it hunts most after sunrise or before sunset, all before those beautiful rays of sunshine illuminate the world and give away its location. It is blending in better with the dark. Add in its sturdier nature, its psychic abilities that it uses to enhance its muscles, and it being regarded as a sacred Pokemon within Hisui, and we have an incredibly tough Pokemon that eventually loses its psychic typing. All because the world around it becomes less harsh, its population rises, and then it no longer needs to fight so hard in order to survive. All resulting in its modern day Unovan form. So not only do we get migration or full immigration with this animal, or Pokemon rather, we also get a complete transformation thanks to it living in less harsh conditions, thanks to its lifestyle changing. Now we can move on to insects. Same as before with birds and any other animal, you're gonna find that they are migrating for some basic reasons. To escape the weather, find food, and maybe even avoid the threat of other creatures that might thrive better in the season they are escaping from. And who better to start this one off than the Pokemon I'm sure everyone knows migrates thanks to the anime, Butterfree. Not only do we see a massive swarm of them fly off in the first season of the anime in Bye Bye Butterfree, which is a reference potentially to Bye Bye Birdie, at least in the English translation, not Japanese, but we also get to see more of this within the Black and White series on Wayfarer Island. Here on this island, there are actually a number of Pokemon that we have already talked about that you would expect to migrate. This includes Swanna, Swablu, Altaria, and even one we didn't really talk about being Swallow, who we can all see within this episode. There are also Ursaring, which bears may actually migrate annually, technically. They aren't undergoing massive migrations like many of our other friends, but they are still shifting their habitat due to things such as food shortages. And once the year is up, they will likely move back and find that the population of animals that they hunt, but more importantly, the many berries and foliage that they eat, will have then been restored. Also, when I say foliage, I really mean to just say like all the different fruits that they eat. This is ultimately considered something called facultative migration, meaning they really aren't trying to migrate regularly, but are pretty much only migrating because they have to for the moment. As stated, they might migrate annually, but that's only if supplies are running low. Back to our focus on this island being Butterfree though, it turns out that Wayfarer Island is known for its massive swarms of Caterpie, which will use this safe space to evolve through Metapod and into Butterfree, finding so much food here that they can evolve pretty quickly and without much threat or worry. To follow this, while the primary inspiration for Butterfree, the swallowtail butterfly, is not known to migrate, we can compare it to its cousin that it is often mixed up with, being the monarch butterfly, which with that we can actually tie in Beautyfly into this, since it is also noted to migrate within an episode of the anime. According to the United States Department of Agriculture, the annual migration of North America's monarch butterfly is a unique and amazing phenomenon. The monarch is the only butterfly known to make a two-way migration as birds do. Unlike other butterflies that can overwinter as larvae, pupa, or even as adults in some species, monarchs cannot survive the cold winters of northern climates. Using environmental clues, the monarchs know when it is time to travel south for the winter. They use a combination of air currents and thermals to travel long distances. Some fly as far as 3,000 miles to reach their winter home. And of course, you may already know about the butterflies that navigate around an invisible mountain, or rather an ancient mountain that doesn't exist anymore, and unfortunately, I have to pop your bubble like mine was popped. Because I'm sorry, but if only after a few short years animals and insects can learn to raid human storages, then why are butterflies just going around an invisible mountain that isn't there? They've had thousands of generations to figure it out, and the answer is simply that there wasn't a ghost mountain. There was likely not even a glacier there that they went around that is ingrained into their DNA to avoid by instinct, and there is no ancient mountain overall. At least, not to my knowledge. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but according to a number of sources and not blogs spreading the same incorrect theory about this ghost mountain, butterflies taking their sudden turn are actually doing this due to three primary reasons: avoid predators, find food for energy, and use the sun or wind currents with that thermals to aid in their travels so that way they can preserve energy. By taking an early turn, they're able to avoid a massive bird population that is just waiting for them. You also can't find milkweed easily over the ocean because it just isn't in the ocean or the lakes. Here in Wisconsin, milkweed is actually an invasive species that is actively decided to be planted by the state parks in order to help the monarchs survive on their journeys. I should know because I was directly told to always cut around them whenever I was tending to the land at the park that I worked at. Lastly, all of nature will do things the most direct and less energy consumptive way. The most efficient way, if you would. This is why streams flow the way they do, by just following the curves, but also wearing things down in the process, so that way they can eventually just go straight instead of meandering. This is why honeycomb cells and beehives are hexagonal, and this is why birds hop around rather than walk, all because these processes conserve energy, or are at least the most efficient. So when you find birds or insects in the sky, they're using the sun to warm them. They are following the air currents and electromagnetic waves, and they are making their migration far easier overall. And as a small note, the ability to detect and use electromagnetic waves is not something restricted to smaller creatures. There are plenty of different animals, both large and small, that do this. Even fish manage to use it to their advantage, especially the ones in the deep, dark depths of our oceans. So yeah, Butterfree and Beautyfly are pretty dope in terms of their migration, assuming we kind of ignore all the powdery scales that they release as they fly, which is likely suffocating and killing entire populations of people in Pokemon, since they are notably poisonous. To tie into our previous butterflies, we also have Vivillon, though it does have a little bit of a different story, as we have to look once again at Pokemon Snap in order to understand why it migrates. But before we even get to that, this Pokemon is found all over the world in 20 distinct patterns, from Archipelago to Fancy, Pokeball to Ocean, and more. Which one is your personal favorite? I'm honestly a big fan of the Elegant pattern, though all of these patterns are really strange. Icy Snow pattern makes sense because it will be able to blend in with the winter snow. Garden pattern still makes sense because it can match the greenery within a garden, and even Marine pattern can fly over the sea undetected as it blends with our blue water. In fact, this isn't as strange as I said it was, as many of these patterns find ways to blend in with their environment in a relatively strange way that might give them away just a little bit. For example, another favorite of mine is the High Plains pattern, which starts orange like clay or iron-rich soil, but then fades into the different layers that we would find if we dug into the ground. The green is a little bit off, but that's okay. It's meant to represent the O layer, I assume, which is otherwise called the organic layer. That's where all the things decompose. As a small side, soil science is arguably one of the most boring natural sciences, and for some reason, when I took a class that talked about soil science in college, it was the only one that made my brain click completely and tell me what I wanted to have a much heavier focus on. But then, as I say, the college I was attending was making some real nasty decisions across the board and I had a dip. Loved my professors though. Back on topic, we find other patterns of Vivillon to not fit as well into nature, but that's okay because they technically aren't meant to. For example, we have the Ocean pattern, which is just representative of the rising sun, Japan, or even the Pokeball pattern. I don't think I have to explain what that represents. Odds are, if you take an extra second, you'll find that these aren't as strange. They can all blend in some capacity for the most part. Even the ones like the Savannah one that would blend with the sky, and the rays of sun similarly to the same way and reason that deer have white spots that help them blend in with the forest as the sun's rays cast down upon them. I could go on and on about all of these, but maybe I should just instead have an entire video all about Pokemon camouflage instead. Now we move back to Pokemon Snap, where we are able to witness multiple different Vivillon in the same exact area, meaning that they could not have been born on this island, otherwise they would all have the same pattern. There's even a specific mission called Valley of Vivillon that can be completed in which every form within Snap gathers together, which is incredibly strange because the trigger for this is that scales from a Vivillon noted to not normally populate the area are found. We're sent on this mission, and then they are all attracted to the energy of a Crystal Bloom, which is something that emits life energy and fills Pokemon up with said energy. This is a common occurrence within Lentil as a whole, but it's still important to note that these Vivillon likely come to these islands in order to find a safe place to have food, shelter, and maybe a few babies, all while soaking in tons of that good energy that is found here. Believe it or not, we only have one more insect before we start talking about all of our aquatic Pokemon. This time we have Dustox to talk about, and considering it is a ravenous Pokemon that consumes incredible amounts of leaves and swarms, we can quickly understand why it might need to migrate. They're noted within Diamond and Pearl episode 73 to migrate over Mount Coronet, which is incredibly significant. It allows us to immediately draw the connection to the Japanese oak silk moth and the Hokkaido spongy moth, though there are others that will fly over the mountain for more than just food or habitat, but also because of their shorter lifespans and their attraction to light, just like how Dustox is attracted to city lights, can we draw this connection a little bit closer. The mountains provide great amounts of food for them, making it much easier to survive, though they have a massive impact on the area as mass outbreaks can cause complete defoliation to trees in the area and can even be more than just a nuisance to the public. It can completely affect how populations function, especially as spongy moths were seen as a majorly invasive species, as they are also able to travel far and survive in numerous varied conditions. And for note, if you decide to look into the spongy moth, it did go by a much more offensive and different name that I will not say here, but let's just say that it was a slur given to Romani individuals. The name has only changed in the last few years because I remember being taught the original name in college. The change occurring in March of 2022, just so you all don't start considering me more ancient than I already am. Give me a few more years and I will learn ancient power so I can evolve into my next form. Nice and easy explanation overall, as we do tie those moths to Dustox here, but I gotta say, spongy moths, kinda cute. I mean, look at their giant antennae and their fuzzy bodies. There are some yellow and pink moths that I actually do find in Wisconsin that are known as the rosy maple moth, and my goodness, I have to say, they're arguably the best flying bug critter I've ever seen, completely outshining every butterfly in my personal opinion. We need a moth Pokemon based on that, please. We're on to the aquatic life within Pokemon. Fish are actually a bit fun because by living within the water, they have to either migrate or find themselves swimming deeper into the water where their temperatures are more stabilized due to the sheer amount of water, which that's also considered a little bit of migration, but we'll talk about that later. To explain it better overall, the surface of the water might be hot or cold to us, but then as we get deeper into the water, it has a temperature that is roughly consistent year-round. I learned this firsthand, and often do, when swimming in Lake Michigan and scuba diving in Florida. The second the floor drops in the lake and there's immediately far more water beneath me, I could just feel how much colder I was. Meanwhile in Florida, despite it being a solid 80 degrees, while in the wetsuit and underwater, I felt the temperatures dropping and stabilizing. It was a bit chilly at first, but thanks to the wetsuit, I was able to have a layer of water that stayed against my body for the entire time and it wasn't replaced, meaning it was warmed up to my temperature and stayed that way to ensure I didn't get cold while swimming. Now, these stabilized waters are a huge advantage because it ensures aquatic life can find food while avoiding extreme temperatures overall. The only issue they might run into is less light filtering through due to thick ice, which would then cause plants to eventually die due to the lack of light, but then that's when our bottom feeders like Magikarp continue to thrive. Assuming the lack of oxygen within the water doesn't cause a major issue then forth. But either way, Magikarp are found naturally in every single region except for Unova. Though I almost guarantee that this is because they haven't been introduced yet, and unfortunately there is a history of carp actually becoming invasive in Unova thanks to their release from a nature preserve. Did I say Unova? I meant to say New York. I'm mixing up the worlds. Somebody help me. So yes, in New York, carp were originally in a nature preserve, which is exactly where we can currently find Magikarp as of Black 2, White 2. So I am guaranteeing if we ever get a game set further in Unova's future, we will find out that Magikarp escaped containment and heavily populated areas within Unova as an invasive species. Within Pokemon episode 109, the Wacky Watcher, that's such a stupid name. We find out that Magikarp are apt to migrate as they will swim around the world and build up strength so that way they can scale waterfalls and evolve into Gyarados. This idea goes back to the old story of the carp that scales the waterfall to become a dragon by passing through the Dragon Gate, a tale that is meant to represent overcoming a great hardship and becoming better because of it. Now, Magikarp is inspired by Asian carp in specific, which is a collection of 4 different carp species: Bighead, Grass, Black, and Silver. Each of them have served to be majorly invasive depending on the regions they have extended their populations to. This has become easier for them through connected waterways like natural rivers, mass flooding events that have occurred, and of course, any man-made canals. What's crazy about this is that I can nearly guarantee that Gyarados is one of the many reasons as to why Magikarp are able to spread so far and wide and are able to migrate even if they're not necessarily invasive everywhere they go, because they aren't necessarily known to attack their own kind despite laying waste to everything and everyone else around it. And if Gyarados is really destroying entire mountains and land, then it could very easily be opening up pathways or waterways by just mass flooding everything around it, then allowing Magikarp to use this to their advantage. And it's not like Magikarp even need water most of the time. They flop on land for long distances, jump over mountains, even flop their way into space, surviving their way back down despite the sheer magnitude of heat, pressure, and whatever other conditions you want to talk about as it reaches maximum velocity and slams down back onto the earth unscathed somehow. There really is nothing we can do about Magikarp, and we're very lucky that it is eaten by a number of different Pokemon such as Pidgeotto, because between it migrating so much and effectively being a major risk of being an invasive species, it would be no surprise if they just kind of took over all sources of water within the world. Directly in the Pokédex, it is noted that in the springtime, schools of Goldeen can be seen swimming up falls and rivers. It is able to swim at a speed of 5 knots, which is roughly 5.7 miles per hour, or 9.26 kilometers an hour, while using its horn to bash through anything that would dare to impede its progress. It's through this process that we can then understand why, when it evolves into Seaking, it is a horn that is hard enough to destroy entire boulders with ease, or at least bore a hole into them, so so that way they can lay their eggs inside of the holes that they created. Both of these Pokemon can be aggressive and very defensive of their eggs, which they will guard for over a month according to Seaking's Emerald Pokedex entry. The reason that they swim upstream when spring rolls in is simply because that is when everything begins to thaw. And with the thawing of ice comes the movement of water, which then carries all the good food with it from the land that has been waiting to be pushed around. Not only that, but not every creature is built to be able to swim against the current like this. Then we add in that because of this, all the fish that can't swim upstream are going to then be dragged down by the water and deposited into a basin alongside whatever nutrients or matter that is being broken down by the river, and all the predators that are looking for a meal are gathering at the basin for that easy meal. It also turns out that the Tosakin goldfish, the fish that Goldeen is likely inspired by, was considered extinct due to the devastation that followed World War II and then the Nankai earthquake in 1946. Though by some miracle, 6 of these goldfish were found at a restaurant in Kochi Prefecture, which only had them as part of a trade for some Japanese spirits. Not ghosts, I mean the alcohol, but it would be pretty funny if they just handed them some sort of Ghostbusters containment device. We're like, yep, here you go, bud. Enjoy your powerful demon that likes marshmallows. These Tosakin have been registered as protected species within the Kochi Prefecture, though the unfortunate bit is that since all Tosakin originate from those 6 that were saved, they are all predisposed to genetic weaknesses as they are all too closely related to each other. Their numbers are pretty low compared to other goldfish, breeding is difficult, and they prefer new water as opposed to old water that other goldfish might prefer, likely because they're primarily seen as bottom feeders, despite being all level feeders, but that's a different story for a different day. Just be happy that Goldeen isn't being, at risk of being extinct. A strange one that definitely doesn't migrate in the traditional sense, but rather migrates vertically, which is something I hinted at earlier, is the football fish, which is what Chinchou and Lantern are likely inspired by. Yes, somehow these creatures of the abyss with their little 4-head attachment is the likely inspiration for our Pokemon, and not just any other anglerfish that we might suspect. Mind you, Chinchou is adorable, and I will not take any slander regarding it. If it smiles at you, your orders are to smile back at it, or you will break its heart, and then I will break your heart. The Chinchou within the anime migrate within Blue Point Isle from one side to the other, leaving the Blue Lagoon that they are spawned into. In fact, there is a man by the name of Daizo who is in charge of the aptly named Parade of the Chinchou held here, making sure they are safely observed and guided to their new life at sea. To explain better, we have the synopsis of this episode from Bulbapedia, which puts it really nicely. The festival celebrates the natural migration of newly hatched Chinchou from the mountains to the ocean. Professor Oak explained that Blue Lagoon was once underwater, but geological forces led to the formation of its present-day landlocked location, though the Chinchou have continued to use it as their breeding grounds. The Chinchou eventually returned to Blue Lagoon's central lagoon to lay their eggs, and the cycle continues on. The Blue Lagoon locals all don blue Hiyori with the Chinchou motif on the back. Afterwards, they gather at the lagoon and along the streets in anticipation for the parade. Stalls sell food and Chinchou-related paraphernalia to commemorate the event. And as the Chinchou emerge from the lagoon, the yellow lights on their antennae create an underwater light show. This procession is now led by specially appointed people to ensure the Chinchou make a safe passage. It has also become a custom for the crowd to splash the Chinchou with water to keep them refreshed as they journey to the sea, which, this sounds pretty freaking fun, and this is just another reason why I would love to be alive within the world of Pokemon, assuming that I wouldn't die a horrible death by fire, stabbing a Beedrill, or otherwise. Now, in regards to those football fish, they, amongst many other sea critters, will vertically migrate at night as they come to slightly shallower water or dive deeper into the water in order to find their fill of food or avoid predators. This goes for tons of different creatures, and I know what you might be saying, well, isn't vertical migration just swimming? Yes, but actually no. You see, this gets really complicated and technical, and it just depends on who you ask at this point. There are layers, though, to the water, just like there are layers to cake, or I guess an onion, because I know one of you, if not multiple of you, thought that out there. And nevertheless, each of these layers have not only those different temperatures we discussed, but also has different pressures within them. Every microorganism, invertebrate, vertebrate, macroorganism, and everything else you can think of has a specified layer or set of layers that they prefer to be in and thrive in. And as a small side, it is typically a strange law of science that is currently believed and relatively accepted, that the deeper you go, the rarer a creature is, but also the larger they tend to be, resulting in colossal squid, or, of course, whales, both being creatures that do dive rather deep into the depths of the world. And I'm sorry to all of you with thalassophobia, I don't have that phobia, but I do have the common sense of, please, for the love of God, do not send me down to the Hadal zone. You know, the literal same zone that is named after Hades. Hadal, Hades. You know, the god of the underworld. It has near freezing temperatures, total darkness, immense pressure, and yet there are many creatures that manage to survive within these depths, including Chinchou and Lantern. And this is also why there's the running theory that if Lantern actually does release light from that far below and with that much pressure, yet said light can be seen on the surface, that there must be an incredible amount of energy being released. And with that much energy being released suddenly and in such a pressurized environment, there's a small chance that something like, I don't know, a black hole could form. So, as such, let's just all be happy that we aren't being crushed by a black hole whenever these adorable guys decide to flash each other. Which, if I had to make a winning bet, I'm pretty positive that they flash their lights like lightning bugs in order to attract a mate towards them. Maybe a future video will be all about the Pokemon mating rituals and stuff like that. Who knows? Clusters of Corsola congregate in warm seas where they serve as ideal hiding places for smaller Pokemon. When the water temperature falls, this Pokemon migrates to the southern seas. This probably comes as a surprise, but not only does this mean that Corsola, of course, migrates, but that when we look at real-life coral, they also tend to migrate, or at least some of them do. And instead of migrating towards warmer seas in order to escape the warming waters that then cause an increase in acidity and then in turn bleach their coral bodies, they are instead moving towards colder waters. Though this does not solve our problem, as an article by Reef Bites explains to us. Numerous studies have documented both terrestrial and marine species moving past their home range in response to warming regional conditions. Species that are living on the edge of their thermal tolerance may shift poleward from the tropical zone to the subtropical. Poleward means away from the equator, or south in the southern hemisphere and north in the northern hemisphere. Basically from center to away. It is an appealing idea, as I continue quoting from them, that corals might survive the heat by migrating, though new locations are unlikely to host the networks of interdependent species of the original range, and species that do manage to relocate or invade, depending on your viewpoint, could also gravely upset the pre-existing environmental balance in their new location. Meaning that through the mass migration of species, we could see entire groups of animals be completely disrupted when they rely on these corals for food or shelter. And then when we translate that into the world of Pokemon, we find that there could be Pokemon such as Marini traveling with them, or small fish that use them for coverage or camouflage, thus putting them in a situation where they have to brave the new environment or learn to survive without their Corsola ally. And even if they do follow along, they could theoretically become an invasive species. And of course, when all of this fails and Corsola are unable to find a safe home for themselves, they pass away, bleached by their environment as they become their Galarian counterpart. Though, if you want to learn more about them, check out my video explaining all of the regional variants of Pokemon. And before we continue, I just want to say, thank you for watching. Thank you for making it this far. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe. I have videos that I release every single week with this level of depth, connecting Pokemon to the real world. Share the video with your friends, hype the video, and leave a comment about anything that surprised you or any information that you would like to share with me, whether it be proving me wrong or supporting something I say. I learn through you almost as much as you guys may learn through me, if not more sometimes. You guys have taught me quite a bit. And if you'd like to go the extra mile, become a member of the channel for as little as $3 a month to help support free content like this for everybody. But enough on that. Thank you again for watching, and on with the video. This next one took some legwork and is a bit more theoretical, but follow me on this because it was the inspiration as to why I wanted to make this video. As we look at Feebas, we know that it is a Pokemon that is directly noted to be incredibly sturdy, while also being so shabby in appearance that other Pokemon don't even want to eat it. Pokemon's words, not mine. There's nothing to argue about it. It's fact. I've seen some of you in the comments get upset about me saying Feebas is ugly, but that's Pokemon, okay? I think it looks like a skeleton, and I kind of dig it. Though, greater than this is that their evolution is completed through prism scales, at least now it is. And while this wasn't always the case, it is the lore that has been set in addition to the fact that these prism scales form on their bodies naturally and may shed off of them. With this in mind, we can actually look at locations like Route 13 within Unova, where we're able to find a prism scale on the route's northeastern shore, but we are unable to find any wild Feebas whatsoever there. In fact, the Feebas are so incredibly far away that we find them on Route 1 if we fish there. Then in Black 2, White 2, we find that both prism scales and Feebas can be found on Route 1 or within Undella Town. Now, you technically can get a prism scale in Undella Town in the first game as well, but the scale we receive is from an individual within the Pokemon Center. When we look into Alola, we find Feebas on Brooklet Hill, but the prism scale is washed up onto Exeggcute Island or southwest of the bay in Kala'e Bay. Once again, incredibly far away from where we are going to find Feebas. We can continue this song and dance throughout the different locations within the world of Pokemon and continue to find the same exact results. Feebas in one location, prism scale somewhere over there. And we can't chalk this up to the possibility that Feebas is being grabbed by a predator bird because guess what? Feebas has no natural born predators. And as such, there's something else going on here, something strange that is hidden as we find that Feebas may have been in a number of these different areas and migrate during heavy rainfall or floods. Maybe over many years they transitioned from one body of water to another as they filled, connected, used the water as a bridge between the two ponds, and then the bridge would eventually dry up, trapping them in their new location. This isn't going to be the case for every location we find Feebas in, but they can survive in murky waters, meaning that they're able to survive conditions in which sediments would be kicked up by large rainfalls and would then be able to take advantage of these transient conditions, hopping from pond to pond until we find them in the locations in which we find them in the games. Alright, if you watched my last video on the death and rebirth of Pokemon, you may want to skip to the next section because we're about to talk about white-striped Basculin again, a Pokemon that does migrate. The white-striped Basculin are one of 3 types of Basculin that exist within the world of Pokemon. They're a strange mix of large bass with the aggressive nature of a piranha mixed with a beta fish, because in all reality, piranhas aren't usually as aggressive as they're made out to be in the movies and so on. People swim in piranha-infested waters all the time, apparently, and at worst have lost a toe due to blood in the water and the fish being incredibly hungry, because, you know, if somebody's waving a delicious smelling piece of meat in front of you and you haven't eaten in a while, yeah, you'd probably bite it also. But Basculin still takes that aggressive nature and ramps it up to a 10, turning it into one of the only 2 Pokemon that do not flee from areas in which Corphish and Crawdons make their home. Feebas being the other one, but also because they don't target Feebas at all. And this is actually only true for red and blue Basculin, this aggressiveness, as white-striped Basculin are said to be far more docile by comparison. In addition, as they move upstream in their migration, there are many things that can and do go wrong, causing the death of many of their kind. Instead of allowing themselves to fully fall into the pit of despair, these Basculin grasp at their family through the Veil of Death and find a way to empower them through rage and sorrow, combining the living and the dead to be reborn as Basculegion. Now, Basculegion is a bit strange because now it takes on the qualities of salmon. The visual breakage of its body that we can see is equated specifically to zombie salmon. And the US Fish and Wildlife Service has an article written by Katrina Liebig on this exact phenomenon, and they even have it as part of another podcast. And they state the following: set in motion at birth, the fate of Pacific salmon is like clockwork. Each year, a new generation returns from sea to spawn, then death. The Pacific salmon spawn only once per lifetime. As they make their final journey home, their silver sides blush, as pigments that give their flesh its appetizing red hue move to their skin. The fat that models their tasty fillets burns up as females become vessels for plump, fatty eggs. For both sexes, fat stored in their muscles and livers is totally used up by the time they reach the spawning grounds. They grind their tails into the gravel, hoping to make deep enough nests that withstand the scour of ice and spring floods. Males then tap into their reserves to grow fearsome teeth and hooked upper jaws that they use to go against and fight each other with. The changes salmon undergo near the end of their life are profound and system-wide, including the eventual widespread deterioration of internal organs. When the frenzy's all said and done, they're spent, their fate is sealed. It's a matter of days, maybe a couple weeks at most. There's even a fish they found that was dead to rights, chunks missing, badly decayed, and its eye was gone. And when they picked it up, it was not only still alive, but it released spawn all over the researchers, and that is still incredibly gross to me after reading this for the 4th time. Twice off camera, twice on camera. It's just a horrifying thing because I know it's supposed to be the fish themselves, but I just imagine a bunch of zombie babies crawling all over me, and that brings a whole new level of horror to the stage. In any case, these Pokemon easily fit into our world of migration and serve as our last fish Pokemon to talk about before we dig into another Pokemon you may have not thought of before migrating. And we jump into the migrational world of plant Pokemon. Yes, plants do migrate, and they do so very actively, not by mistake. This is a concept that seems wild to us, but there are a lot of studies that have gone into understanding that this is just simply a fact. We as humans often see movement as a sign that something is alive. Dogs, they bark, run, and fart at us while they sleep on the couch. Birds, well, they squawk and fly all around us, high in the sky, and make a mess through eating a bunch of seeds. Raccoons, they get a little quirky at night and work their way into our trash cans, steal from campers, and drag their fat little bellies across the ground. The last part was something I personally had to deal with, and the camper claimed up and down that a person snuck into their camp and stole their food. For note, there were wrappers and pieces of food left as a trail into the forest, all of which had bite marks. So if it was human, they had tiny teeth and were clearly very hungry. Yes, we made fun of that camper for a long time in private. Back on track though, because we look at for all of these different traits to determine if something is alive, we often miss that plants are very much alive and can see, quote unquote, the world around them. They just don't see it in the same exact way that we do. Dandelions are able to feel the currents of air before they release their seeds to float upon the wind. When plants grow, their vines are able to continually swing their vine in a circle until suddenly they stop and cut across their circle pattern to immediately grab a pole that they wish to climb up, and so much more. It's all been documented time and time again, though it takes a lot of time and a good time-lapse video to see it in its full effect. I personally love to move my plants just a little bit away from the sunlight in order to make them grow a certain direction as they try to maximize their sunlight potential. And before I finally move on to talk about our plant Pokemon, there's been a lot of debate on whether or not plants have consciousness, but I won't talk about that here. I at least just wanted to mention it. Instead, we'll talk about Exeggcute, because nothing in its information across any medium states anything about it migrating, though what we do find out is that in the real world, coconuts have genuinely floated across the waters of the world and quote-unquote migrated to new islands that they were then able to populate. And when we look at Exeggcute, we find that it is no different. Exeggcute Island, routes 26 and 27, which are connected to the greater ocean in Kanto, routes 34 to 39, which start on a rocky coast but then lead into more forested areas, route 18 as a swarm in Unova, which is an island that is believed to have been a contiguous area with the desert resort, and more locations that follow a similar formula. This is no mistake. These are specifically planned out areas in which we do find an intentional placement of these Pokemon. Sure, the graphics aren't the greatest, but I've never cared about that when it comes to these games, because this is what I've loved, because there's tons of story, tons of fun to be had, and a lot of love put into it by the people who make the game directly. And then this very intentional connection to ecology. And if somehow it is all one massive coincidence, then I don't know what to say. Because it is a coincidence that many people who have better education in ecology and environmental studies have seen alongside me and agree that this must be intentional. And it's just beautiful. Also, just imagine the first couple of Exeggcute just floating across the water to their first islands, where they eventually begin to populate entire forests. A short case study we have is actually found within the Pokemon Adventures manga, and it's when Red sees an entire forest moving at once in a mass migration. Editing Acrylic here, I somehow managed to mix up red and yellow in my memory, even though yellow is clearly the superior character in all of Pokemon. Either way, if I say he, if I say red, ignore that, it's actually yellow. Once he finds solid ground up and away from danger, he takes a closer look through binoculars to find out that the horde of trees are in fact Exeggcute and Oddish, moving in tandem away from a greater threat that was unknown at the time of the event. This mass migration actually caused a Farfetch'd to be displaced from its home, as it could no longer find the nest that it left in order to find its own fill of food. It's not a major case of migration, or a regular one, but it's important to note that even mass groups of Pokemon might migrate in order to find safety against predators or major perceived threats. Hoppip's evolutionary line is a strange one to consider migratory as a whole, but I feel as though it fits, because for starters, Hoppip can already be found all over the world simply because they are easily blown by even the most gentle of breezes. And since they enjoy these gentle winds, they just kind of say, oh, this is nice. I'll just close my eyes for a minute. Then the next thing you know, they're deep within the base of the cartel with a brick in their hands. No idea how they got there, but they're there now. They're able to grab onto something to stop themselves from floating away, but it really is up to time and age for them to reach the point in which they are able to control themselves better. This is when we do get into Skiploom, who is absolutely a migratory creature, as the Violet Dex entry states, when the weather grows cold, Skiploom's flower closes and the Pokemon cannot photosynthesize, so it flies away to warmer regions. To pair with this, the Scarlet entry states that Skiploom enthusiasts can tell where Skiploom were originally born from the scent drifting from the flower on the Pokemon's head, and as a side to this, I would never ever be able to do that. I have always had a poor sense of smell, and the other day I had thought I could smell cinnamon, when in fact my fiance, who has a very strong, good sense of smell, stated that it was just the smell of a grill using charcoal. Those two smells smell nothing alike, and I will never fully understand smells no matter how long I live. Back on track again, that whole part where I said it was up to this Pokemon's age to help it be able to control how it moved in the air or migrated wasn't a joke or a metaphor or whatever else. This is one of the only lines of Pokemon, if not the only line of Pokemon, that does evolve directly through age and will die once it reaches its final form. While Jumpluff can use its Cotton Puff spores to float around as it wishes, it will release these spores, apparently not seeds, all over the world. Though once all of these spores have been released, its journey ends, and so does its life as it passes away. By this point, they will have at least circled the globe with their cat smile on their face, having seen all the sights that the globe then has to offer. Our last plant is Snover, who actually does the opposite of pretty much every other Pokemon that we've talked about today. Instead of migrating away from colder areas, it will instead migrate towards colder areas. In the summer, as the sun shines longer, it will decidedly stay up higher in the mountains where it resides. In doing so, it is able to stay where it is colder, thus keeping that layer of snow on its body. More importantly, Snover is able to face less competition from other plant-based Pokemon and have less threats from Pokemon that may attack it for its berries by staying in colder zones. It can even outcompete other plant Pokemon easier, not just because of its evergreen body capable of withstanding the cold better, but also because it digs its roots into the snow in order to absorb water and cool down its body temperature. How far roots can grow is incredibly important for a plant and their ability to compete. In fact, there are many plants that are invasive species that are able to grow their roots deeper into the soil, thus allowing them to siphon away water from other plants in the area before the water table rises enough for said plants to even get a drop of water, meaning that these deeper rooting plants can effectively kill other plants through dehydration. And this will then lead to more of these plants thriving in this location as all other plants die and it takes over. This can then extend into draining the area of its normal water table, drying it all out in the process. But hey! Doom and gloom aside, at least Snover isn't like this, and we just have to stay away from it when Big Papa Abomasnow is around, unless we want to know what it's like to be ground zero for a whiteout snowstorm. I've grouped our reptilians and amphibians together here, and even though these are more than just that, as I even have a dragon in this section, but hey, these groups were never meant to be perfect, just a rough organization tool for my own sanity, and for some people who might want that. So we start with Slowpoke, who is just so incredibly stupid, and another top tier Pokemon in my heart. I mean, we are talking top 15 or 20 for all of their forms bundled up together. They're just that perfect in my eyes. Though, despite me loving them, Slowpoke are effectively so incredibly dim-witted that at least within the anime, they almost drove themselves to extinction within a specific section of the world by literally watching water go away from their very eyes. Like, they literally watched as their source of water slowly disappeared, watched it get streamed away, and did nothing about it. Didn't even try to follow it. And of course, they get their fill of food by primarily staying near sources of water in which fish inhabit. So once the water dries up, they not only lose their source of hydration, but also lose their food source. Long story short, if it weren't for Ash and the gang helping evolve a Slowpoke into the great and intelligent Slowking, they would have effectively gone extinct. And I would love to have a real-life tie-in for Slowpoke, but it really is just an incredibly strange Pokemon. You can compare it to the Japanese giant salamander, which does migrate upstream into smaller areas where the water initially collects in order to have its eggs before moving back down. Though that habit really isn't expressed in our little Slowpoke, and when the company decided to create Quagsire, we see a stronger connection between them. Funny enough, Quagsire does not migrate, from what I could find, but it does have an annual celebration for the ones that live in the Blue Moon Falls. When the moon is full, they then try to launch objects as high as possible in an attempt to hit the moon. Another you were likely expecting from the beginning is Torterra, who live in herds and will migrate together as they search for clean water. In doing so, they create the illusion of an entire forest moving just like Exeggcute does, though it is assumed that once they find the place they enjoy most, they become mostly or completely immobile. This then leads into the canonical theory that Torterra make up the planet itself, that there was a gigantic Torterra deep beneath the earth that we stand on. And to be entirely fair, it's kind of plausible when we look at a lot of the evidence. Even if we ignore the beautiful scene in Pokemon Detective Pikachu where we get to see the massive groups of Torterra that completely overshadow humans as though we were but a breadcrumb, we can look at other Pokemon and how they've become massive in size. For example, Alpha Pokemon, which are just Pokemon that are full of life energy, which is the same for the Illumina Pokemon in Lental, the Titan Pokemon in Paldea, and the Totem Pokemon in Alola. Each of these Pokemon are massive in size and have taken on these forms through some level of excess energy. And we are eventually explained that at least with Alpha Pokemon, it is a natural form of energy, or at least theorized by the character that introduces us to Alpha Pokemon within Legends ZA. He believes this, and I'm willing to believe him with all the evidence I've seen, but that's explained better in my Alphas and Megas Pokemon video if you want those details. Instead, if we take the concept of Alpha Pokemon, understand that it is natural life energy that causes it, and apply it to Torterra, then it would make perfect sense that there is at least one massive Torterra underneath at least one continent within the world. Though to be clear, this is primarily a reference to the world turtle, a turtle that was believed to live under the planet holding it up. This belief was held by a number of different cultures in the past, which I always personally love when we get different cultures coming up with the same ideas or worshiping the same gods, so on and so forth. It makes you really wonder what could be real, what could they have seen, and what myths are actually fact, or some strange twisted fact. Zweilous is technically less migratory and more of a nomadic Pokemon. This is because it doesn't seem to actually display any behavior in turning back around and going back to old homes or locations. Instead, it will eat everything it can within its territory, then move on to the next territory. And if you want to be incredibly technical about it, this would then be considered facultative migration, as we talked about with our bears. It's only migrating around because it has no choice to if it wants to survive to the next day, and maybe it'll turn back around to places it's been. And considering Zweilous also fights with itself a lot, the two different heads having different likes and dislikes, then they're definitely wasting a bunch of calories, meaning they will most likely be eating even more than you may expect. They primarily live in caves, so it wouldn't be any surprise to find out that they're moving to different cave openings by traveling through all the different tunnels. And in this process, they really are just eating any Pokemon they would consider prey, which is a lot of different Pokemon. Zweilous just has to be able to see the prey first because it's, a little bit blind. I blame the hair. It's kind of adorable, but maybe we set Zweilous up with a stylist and get some new do's going. Our final Pokemon in this section is the marine reptile Lapras. It is based on the Plesiosaur, and any amounts of behavioral science regarding extinct animals before we continue may get a little bit funky because, we weren't around to see it. We can have a billion pieces of evidence that supports our theories, but we could also just be, wrong. Although, if we base everything on the evidence we do have, just like Lapras, we do find the Plesiosaurs had a worldwide distribution, fossils being found all over the place as long as there was once water in that section. And if we consider that massive animals like whales need to travel long distances in order to ensure that they get their necessary fill of food, then it is pretty sensible to make the assumption that a large-necked creature like the Plesiosaur would do the same. As a side, I know this is wrong of me, but I kind of just want to see something grab the Plesiosaur like a cartoon character, maybe even like Hulk and Loki, and just swing it around by the neck as if it was some sort of massively oversized flail. This I don't know why. It's a thought that goes into my head. This is why I don't have superpowers, because sometimes the intrusive thoughts win, and I don't think the universe would be ready for my stupidity. But onto Lapras proper, they are noted to migrate annually from the Orange Islands to the Johto region, with a singular Lapras that usually leads the group in their traveling. And while doing so, assuming they are in a good mood, they will sing. And I'd like to then imagine a group of Lapras being called a choir, as they would sing together while moving, though now we can actually support the reason for their migration being the same as the Plesiosaur, as once the population of Lapras started to come back, they caused a decline in the fish population in any area where there are too many of this big blue marine reptile. In other words, Lapras choirs eat their fill, travel somewhere new, eat their fill, and then continually traveling or turn back. Diglett's migration is a bit of one that makes perfect sense when we think about it, but was only ever suggested to be a thing within the Power of One movie as they carried away Professor Oak's bike. Diglett are incredibly important for the ecosystem. I would even argue that it is easily a keystone species within the world of Pokemon, which keystone species video needs to be its own thing one day as well. But even through the manga, Elite Four's Koga tells us all about how important that Diglett and Onix are to the ecosystem. As we already know, through the decks, that Onix creates tunnels that Diglett will then use, which at first seems redundant considering that Diglett are able to, dig, hence the name Diglett. But it's more than that. By having a large tunnel already created, a vast network like an ant maze is completed. This maze connects locations that are incredibly far from each other and would otherwise take Diglett potentially their entire lives to reach. But with Onix, this process is expedited and made far easier. Further than this, Diglett are important as they churn up the soil, aerating it, and promoting the growth of plant life. And this is what helps me love the Pokemon manga even more, or even how connected Pokemon is to ecology. And to close off this short section then, moles don't actually migrate. At best, they go deeper underground to avoid the harder soil caused by freezing temperatures, so, okay, maybe they technically do vertical migration, but I'll leave that up to you. That's still a weird new term to me. In Pokemon Diamond and Pearl episode 44, there is an entire herd of hippopotas that are shown to be migrating. Unfortunately, they got lost and made their way to a ledge cliff where they are ultimately stranded and need help. While Hippopotas dislikes water, its evolution Hippowdon has been shown to not only dive into the sands, but also into small bodies of water. They really are just primarily the opposite to a real hippo, and that hippos typically stick to the water, but when we do look at our real life animal, we can find that hippos also migrate. Consistent reports have found that since they are so incredibly reliant on water, hippos are very vulnerable to disturbances in their habitats for how much water there is in a given area. So, for example, if their bed of water begins to dry up, they need to move or they will struggle to survive pretty quickly. As such, they have to time their movements with the wet and dry seasons. They need to give the larger bodies of water that stay around all year the time they need to build up aquatic plants, but they also need to eat their fill of, at minimum, 80 pounds or 40 kilograms a day in order to survive. As such, they have to migrate over to other bodies of water that can support their life and diet before moving back to their favorite spots. Luckily, hippos have a very sedentary lifestyle where they just kind of laze about all day, floating in the water while they bask in the sun. Otherwise, they'd be eating far more. And with teeth like those, I don't think anyone's going to stop them. And I'll be honest, I'm not afraid of hippos, but if you put me in a room and told me I had to fight a bear or a hippo, I'm gonna choose the bear every single time. The hippo is likely just gonna make a mess of me since it doesn't want to eat me, while the bear wants to conserve energy and kill me as fast as possible. I mean, come on, even crocodiles are afraid of hippos, and crocodiles can be scary, and this is coming from the guy who was born in Florida. I am willing to wrestle a crocodile or alligator, but again, not a hippo. I'm gonna follow the crocodile and stay away from the hippo. Migrating seasonally, just as real deer and bucks do, we have Saucebuck, the Pokemon that is representative of our 4 primary seasons. And yes, I say primary seasons because then we get into things like monsoon or hurricane season, or if you're crazy and just accept it, we also have fire season, which really isn't a natural occurrence and is just humanity's way of accepting the trash fire that we started and keep adding fuel to. You know what, I was gonna stop myself, but no, let's take a tangent. Skip ahead if you want to miss the rants, but trust me, you're gonna want to stick around for it because I haven't done these in a while. Because sure, there are plenty of different reasons as to why natural wildfires happen, while they are incredibly important. they renew the soil, they grant a reset to the ecosystem that they occur in, and they even help trees, like certain firs, burst their cones open. These cones are covered in a resin, sealed to ensure they are kept safe. It can only break open to release seeds when a high temperature is achieved. This effectively then means that nature is meant to have fires, or at least these trees have adapted to outcompete other plants in the event a fire does happen, which ultimately just helps other plants regrow as the roots of the tree hold the soil. But what isn't good is overuse of water for things like, generative AI. Don't get me wrong, AI is a tool used for decades for helping us analyze information or automatically calculate information in an easier format that we as humans can then design from with our human meat brains, not creating art from it, not generating art from AI. Meanwhile, things like generative AI draws up water due to cooling needs through excessive energy use. Governments within America, influenced by corporations, have taken water away from the public when it was necessary to fight against fires or heat, as they just dry up the land more, meaning that they're not using the water when it was necessary or when people needed it most, and it caused people to die. I'm not going to say pass away. They died. And overall, people are just being ridiculous with how all of this functions. I guarantee I'm going to get one AI bro telling me how generative AI is useful, just like the 15 different companies that want to sponsor me every month that are generative AI based. But here's the thing. When you are going to sit here and say, oh, I can replace one person in my company, that means the rest of your company can be replaced by AI as well, meaning there's no value to you. And you know what I say? Bridge the gap yourself with books, research, and actual effort instead of ruining the planet that I love. I despise how often I get sponsorship offers from generative AI places because even all of their emails are the exact same. Half of them don't even say Acrylic on the email. I even turned down Temu because their parasitic practices. Mass produce cheap products that are potentially harmful to people and the environment, sell them for cheap, take their information, sell it on the internet. Though I will say that last part, that whole take information part, is allegedly, because I'm not a professional, nor have they been judged to do so on the Temu app. On a different app they have been, though. This isn't political, by the way. This is just the truth. So anyone who says otherwise in the comments is just as delusional as anti-vaxxers. Yeah, I'm just firing shots today because I realize I haven't done this in a long time. I would say I'd come after the flat earthers and the sovereign citizens next, but the lack of oxygen to their brains will cause them to pass away before I even get to find them. So, Anywho, back to talking about a creature with a brain, we have Sawsbuck, who is seen as more than just a migratory creature. It is actually seen as the harbinger of spring. And if we tie this to real-life counterparts, we find that the home range, quote-unquote, of a deer or buck is not a square mile, as a lot of people weirdly say, but rather anywhere that it feels comfortable, anywhere that it feels its needs are met. And so it may have a range of 10 or 15 square miles, as it might be one of only 4 deer within a massive area. This massive area may look terrible to us and may have very little foliage, but for a small number of deer, it suffices and meets their needs. When we then turn back to Sawsbuck and Deerling, their populations are strangely consistent year-round on any of the routes that they live on. This assumption is made by looking at their encounter rates, which, if you were to encounter 100 Pokemon, then 30 of them should be 30 different Deerling in certain versions of the game or certain locations. This is the same assumption I make in my Pokemon ecology videos, which, yes, Galar is on its way. I fear that beast, but it is coming very soon. Despite this population percent staying consistent, it could just be because we are also looking in the grass in these routes. And with deer nesting in large swaths of grass that they can lay down in for cover, it's no surprise that their encounter rates don't change at all. But between looking at Pokédex information and real-life deer as we have, it is very clear that they do migrate. What may be happening then is that the areas in which we find them are able to just simply support the lives of their herds very well. We move on to oddball Pokemon, of which there are only 2, and then we get onto our legendary and mythical Pokemon. Don't know why I said that so weird. Opening the door for us is Klefki, who is hard to say that it migrated and more that it just kind of immigrated from one location to a new one altogether. Klefki used to live in caves where they would absorb metallic ions from the ores in the area. Due to human expansion and mining, the food supply for Klefki would eventually be wiped out, and then they would move away from these caves. Their new homes would be within places such as the Lost Hotel or Lumio City's sewer system, any place where they can not only get their keys, but moreover are able to absorb metallic ions while also avoiding any would-be predators, anything that eats metal in the games. We don't really know how long these Pokemon live, but considering they are Fairy and Steel, 2 types that we associate with longevity, it could be assumed that they live incredibly long lives. So, I would like to believe that they're able to wait as long as necessary before moving back into the caves to find new tunnels and let them find new sources of their favorite food. Until then, it'll just drift around and pick up whatever keys it's able to in order to get its fill. Though the greatest outlier, the greatest oddball and anomaly of the ecosystem every time it comes up is here, Ditto. And I have seen Ditto as a massive headache for far too long. I love it as a Pokemon, but when I look at it in the ecological sense, I crumble on the inside. To catch you up to speed, Ditto is a Pokemon that absolutely does not need to eat anything at all. It has a capacity to transform into anything and everyone, whether it be humans, objects, Pokemon, you name it. And as such, it can effectively just eat anything that anyone else eats. Yet it is not a predator. It is not a Pokemon that even hunts. Not even for a blade of grass, and you find it existing most often in any place where humans stay away from, with a few exceptions. For example, we see them in Cerulean Cave, where we find Mewtwo, Giant Chasm, where we get Kyurem, Pokemon Village, where we see Mewtwo again, protecting other Pokemon, Mirage Cave, and Mirage Island in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, Mount Hokulani in Alola, and many, many others. They actively hide from others, blending in with society of humans or within groups of Pokemon, and considering their ability just allows them to turn into a plant and photosynthesize if they become a plant-based Pokemon, it's easy to see how they are becoming stranger ecosystem-wise by the second and how in the world they even fit in. Adding further to this, you can't make more Ditto, they just simply exist. But you can breed other Pokemon with them. Even the Pokemon that don't have genders can breed with Ditto to make more babies, which raises more questions because Ditto is absolutely passing traits such as nature's from itself to others, meaning that DNA is absolutely involved. But now we get into Ditto being found within every region except for Hoenn, back in the original games at least. Yet here's the kicker still, you cannot find them in Hisui, but in modern day Sinnoh, they might appear with your radar, meaning that they didn't have a population there originally. And just as a note, I always have to say Ditto has been confirmed to not be a failed clone of Mew or any other Pokemon. It's simply a strange creature that exists and will always exist. And we can assume that if it does migrate, which explains why it's found everywhere, it does so while traveling between groups of Pokemon and blending in with the goal of finding a more permanent, safe home for itself. This might be bold to state, but I do believe that Mewtwo is technically a migratory Pokemon, though that will depend on the versions of the games that you're playing, since it was also held as a prisoner by Team Flare for a number of years, thanks to the info within Legends ZA that also references the Pokemon Adventures manga, but again, that's kind of it's a sequel, but it's also like its own timeline thing. We're not going to worry about that. Let's just look at the facts. Mewtwo is a Pokemon that is designed to be stronger than anything found in nature and is a protector of all Pokemon and by some extent, humanity. It gains understanding of its own birth and the circumstances of life as a whole, which allows it to be compassionate towards others in new ways, even fighting off a Genesect that was not compassionate towards others. We find it in Cerulean Cave, and in its sister location, the Unknown Dungeon in Kalos. Within Cerulean, we find an immense swath of powerful wild Pokemon collecting there. You're even prevented from entering for your own safety until after you've become a champion, and of course, deep within the cave, we do find Mewtwo. If we're assuming that Pokemon are attracted to incredibly high amounts of energy, as they are in Lumio City in Legends ZA, then we can easily assume any other Pokemon that emits an incredibly high amount of energy would then attract other Pokemon to it, which I'm pretty sure is also what happens with Z Crystals and Totem Pokemon in Alola, but whatever. This still allows us to then explain why this cave is so dangerous. But the same cannot be said about the unknown cave within Kalos, because just outside of this cave do we find Pokemon Village, which is where it's located at, a place where Pokemon hide away from humans out of fear or mistreatment. It's here that they're also protected by Mewtwo, similar to how Mewtwo protects clone Pokemon within the anime. This is also reflected within the Pokemon Adventures manga as extra support to this, and when we look at this location, we do find Pokemon that are roughly in the same level range as the Pokemon we find within Cerulean Cave, making them even more similar. What I would like to believe then is that Mewtwo may have switched between these locations to keep an eye on all these Pokemon and protect at least the ones in Pokemon Village, while leaving when necessary. If this isn't the case, then it could also be said that Mewtwo simply moved to the Pokemon Village on its own after some time. Maybe it was attracted to Kalos as a whole and the Mega Phenomenon. Maybe it had other plans. After all, despite being an artificial Pokemon, it has 2 Mega Stones. All of this being something that I really should explain in its own video someday, revolving completely around Mew and Mewtwo. Moving on to Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, the trio of Pokemon that we have seen since Generation 1 have long been confirmed to be migratory Pokemon. This begins with the understanding that the trio are seen as the harbingers of winter, spring, and summer. Articuno bringing in the cold gales of winter and its snow, Zapdos summoning roiling human thunderstorms in summer, actually, and Moltres directly stating that its arrival is the sign of an early spring. They're said to travel all over the world, and we do find them in the Sea Spirit's Den in Kalos, but we also get to see them in a number of different locations in the games. The strangest to me is Zapdos being in the abandoned power plant until you realize that its presence there is helping other electric Pokemon get their fill of electricity as they need. In fact, all 3 of these Pokemon affect the ecosystems that they fly to, but I also have a whole video on that which you can check out. Instead, I want to focus on a detail that I strongly believe connects these Pokemon to their Galarian counterparts. Because while we have these Pokemon, we are still missing the 4th season in representation, being autumn. And some people might say Lugia represents autumn because Lugia can be associated with monsoons, which typically occur during the seasonal shifts of warm summers into the colder autumns. But we have a better, more direct connection in the Galarian variants. This trio literally eats from a red-leafed Dyna tree, migrating here every single year in order to get their fill of the fruit. And there are many cases in which people believe they see all 3 legendary birds flying overhead. And there's a major flaw with this, because Galarian Zapdos decidedly does not fly. It runs at Mach speeds across the lands. In addition, while you might mistake Articuno's 2 different forms from a distance, especially at high-speed movement, you can't tell me that you would mistake the 2 different Moltres for each other. They're just so drastically different that you may as well consider yourself medically blind if you believe you would mistake one for the other. Because of this, the most logical explanation is that the 2 different trios of legendary birds are in fact the same trio. That they travel around the world, come back to this Dyna tree, eat up the fruit, transform, and on their migration back, they use up the excess energy that they are filled with. Pokemon have transformations caused by the food they eat or the items they touch all the time, whether it be Herba Mystica causing Titan Pokemon, the orbs that grant Kyogre and Groudon more power, or even their primal forms, or any number of items that help your average Pokemon evolve. Would it be such a foreign or taboo idea to consider that maybe our birds transform simply by eating the fruit of a great tree that was likely created by Calyrex, another legendary Pokemon? I don't think so, and it's a story I'm going to be sticking to until we are told otherwise or have better evidence. Now for the Pokemon on the thumbnail, +1, actually technically +2, Kyogre, Groudon, and Rayquaza. Now what I really love about this is that Geek Ecology and Poketsunami came together in their translation of the Pokemon Ecology book, and our Eco Geek talked about how Kyogre must be a migratory creature. But here's the kicker. Not once did he mention in that video anything about how it actually migrates within the world of Pokemon. He simply analyzed it for the type of whale that it was and its overall body composition. He used real-life science, which I will tell you he knows way more about animal biology and natural ecology than me, I am sure. So it was actually amazing to follow up talking with them about how Kyogre does migrate. And while we often associate our duo here with Hoenn, there's a location called the Embedded Tower within Johto, a place that was actually built for all 3 of the super ancient trio, meaning even Rayquaza was meant to visit this location. The purpose as a hidden tower was simply to provide the trio with a place to rest. Its history is as follows. A long time before the events of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the Embedded Tower was an enormously tall tower built by people who came from the Hoenn region. Its peak was said to touch the sky, and part of it was embedded into the cliffs of Route 47, running deep underground into the ocean, thus connecting the land, the sea, and the sky. This is more than just a location for rest on a great migration. It is a holy place for these Pokemon and the people that worship them. But why would these Pokemon need to rest, you ask? Well, whenever they do waken, they aren't actually always combating with each other. Sure, they rest deep below the surface as they try to absorb the natural energy of the world, which is known as primal energy, but they do more than just that. Kyogre brings rain and expands the ocean. Groudon gets rid of flooding and expands the land. And Rayquaza is the emperor of the atmosphere, as it literally releases ozone particles, or at least in the Pokemon Adventures manga it does that. And it's because of these three that we have a working planet to begin with. Again though, I've mentioned and explained this in many different videos, so I'm just going to let it go for now, and we're going to continue forward. As such, with three Pokemon that effectively represent the constant changing and shifting of land, water, and air, they're pretty hard at work and need a place to rest. They don't just teleport across the world as some Psychic-type Pokemon are apt to do, looking at you, Mew. But these three are effectively forced to travel at their pace across the planet, which poor Groudon actually has it the worst, because both Kyogre and Rayquaza are able to fly. Poor oversized Magma Lizard is stuck waddling his way all the way back to wherever he wants to rest, so with this in mind then, it only makes sense that a tower would be created as a resting spot. What I wonder is if there are any other towers in the world that are intended to work this way, and once again, that's just a question for another day. I love Manaphy and Phione, though not because of the Pokemon themselves. Sure, they're cute and all, but I love them because of them just being the sea angel brought into the world of Pokemon. They have the same exact colors, the same red core in their eggs, or rather bodies, and they even migrate in a similar way to the way that Manaphy and Phione do. Manaphy is stated to be born on a cold seafloor. It will swim great distances to return to its birthplace. Meanwhile, Phione drifts in warm seas. It always returns to where it was born, no matter how far it may have drifted. In other words, they're moving pretty far over time as they drift throughout the sea back and forth, and Manaphy lays eggs through some process before they hatch into Phione, but even this isn't much of a mystery when we look at everything regarding sea angels. Because not only do they have the Latin name of Clyone Lemacina, or Lemacina, which is very close to Phione, Clyone, but they are also hermaphrodites, having both male and female productive organs, or reproductive organs, which would even lead into why Manaphy and Phione don't have a male or female gender, and why we've seen Manaphy referred to as both Prince and Princess of the Sea, depending on the medium which we see them in, which is primarily in the Pokemon Ranger games. I really wanted to find out, though, why Japanese people really love sea angels so much, but I couldn't find anything concrete, so I don't even know if they actually love them that much, or if it's just more of a rumor or an old thing. I could find generalizations like them being seen as graceful, majestic, or even pretty, that they were popular at one point, but I couldn't find a single story or legend about them, even by looking closer at Hokkaido's stories. Maybe I missed something and someone in the audience can let me know. For now though, we're going to move on to our next entry. I actually want to get the simple and underwhelming Pokemon out of the way and end on the last two really strong entries as we talk about Kubfu. Simply put, it was stated that they live in mountainous areas far away from the Galar region, although they lived in the region at some point. According to historical texts, Kubfu used to travel to uncharted lands with people as they went to trade or explore. Records suggest that the Kubfu living in the faraway mountains in the present day may have descended from the Kubfu that became naturalized in the distant lands they visited in the past. So they used to migrate quite a bit even in the past. As such, for some unknown reason though, we find that Kubfu are immigrating to other lands, not just migrating. It could be part of their journey to become masters of their fighting styles, or it could be that they are aiming for another goal. This other goal could be to purify spirits throughout the world, which is an ability that its evolution Urshifu is said to have. So maybe they act as a nomadic species that will have populations built up wherever they're needed most, or wherever they're most interested, such as on the Isle of Armor. Much like the legendary birds, the Genie Quartet, otherwise known as the Forces of Nature, Tornadus, Thundurus, Landorus, and Enamorus, are all migratory creatures. In fact, the entire purpose of them changing from their incarnate forms and into their Therian forms explains this. The incarnate forms are exactly as stated, the incarnations of nature itself, as they are kami, spirits of nature, representing the seasons in their own right. Tornadus is based on the Fujin, the kami of wind. Thundurus, Raijin, kami of thunder. Landorus, the deity of the land, which may refer to Inari, the kami of harvests. And Enamorus appears to be based on Ugajin, the kami of fertility, thus why it would represent spring. the time in which the winter thaws and plenty of creatures start making babies. It's directly stated that not only does Enamorus leave because it hates the cold, but also that these Pokemon take on their Therian forms in order to travel around the world faster. They cross entire oceans in these forms and will only transform back into their incarnate forms so they can rest, or just if they find a place that they want to stay, though they have a preference towards any of the places that they are worshipped at. After all, what kami can say no to a shrine dedicated to their honor? Our final entry for today is Shaymin, a Pokemon that has a behavior that is described as flower carrying, though I will be honest, can't really remember where that term came from unless it really is from the Shaymin and the Sky Warrior movie, which is also where we learned about the habits of Shaymin groups. Once again, we don't have group names for Pokemon, so I'm going to call a group of Shaymin a hedge. So then a hedge of Shaymin will gather in fields all over the world before transforming and flying to their next destination. These Pokemon are closely tied to the Gracidia flower, a sign of thanks or gratefulness, which is why Shaymin are the Pokemon of gratitude. But while they are closely tied to the flower in the anime, and have at least an association with the rare flower in the games, we have more going on here. By starting in one field and then traveling to another, they literally are going through a process of not only migrating as a hedge, but also helping plants migrate through their seeds. Because wherever they land is where they help seeds spread and causes the life there to flourish, primarily flowers. And what I love is that I recently found out that this isn't just a trait held by Shaymin. For example, Eldegoss is noted to spread seeds around, but in Pokemon Snap, it is explained that they spread seeds of all kinds all over the world, which I guess technically this means that our final entry is Shaymin and Eldegoss. Oops. Or at least wherever they rather travel for Eldegoss. And with this then, we can explain how Pokemon are able to not just survive, but be fully sustained and thrive within the world. Because they spread seeds from all kinds of plants and help them grow, they don't just spread spores or seeds from their own type of plant, helping herbivorous Pokemon get their fill of food. And back to Shaymin then, with it gathering in fields and spreading flowers, then they have a massive effect on all sorts of other Pokemon. And that starts all the way down with the pollinators of the world. But that concludes every Pokemon that migrates, which is wild to actually be able to track down. There were way more than I had originally expected, and I still excluded Pokemon that I didn't feel like I had just enough evidence for. But let me know in the comments if I missed any, or if you have any arguments, or just what you think in general. Make sure you're also subscribed for all that good weekly content, and if you'd like to go the extra mile to support the channel, become a member for as little as $3 a month. The extra support goes a long way to support free content for everyone. Plus then you get extra perks like behind the scenes info, and normally I would be doing the end credits with showing everyone's names and shouting your name out at the end, but instead I'm just letting it scroll on screen because you guys were very generous last month when the channel was actually suffering a little bit because of just the reach of the videos just weren't going anywhere. I know everyone's pretty busy. People are enjoying their time with their families and their friends at the end of the year here, and then you were going above and beyond and being very kind and giving to the channel. And so there were over 370 members of the channel that were, at least a good chunk of them were gifted to the channel by some very generous individuals. And the only reason I'm not shouting out everyone's names is because we'd be here for a good, 3, maybe 4 minutes. My voice would get completely shredded. I don't think anyone wants to sit through those credits. Tell me if you believe otherwise. Like, if everyone thinks that, I should sit here and go through all of it, even if I have 300 plus members, sure, you know what, maybe I'll listen to you guys. But I think the majority of you will agree that shouting out every single person's name might not be the most pleasing for the ears. After this though, I intend to work on a very fun video regarding the original dragon. So keep your eyes out, and I hope to see you in that video. And as always, don't do anything I wouldn't do. Don't do anything I would do. Please be nice to each other. I love you, and I'll see you next time.